Ah, you've dodged a bullet this week.
Hey, poor! Hey, poor! Hey, poor! You don't have to be poor anymore! Jesus is here!
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, not far from the redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is in my lap demanding attention because he's a cat, and that's what cats do. Now, normally this would be a Apocrypha episode, or I should say an Apocrypha episode. But not last week, but the week before, they came up to me and said, you're on 10-hour days from now on. Boy. 10-hour days means I have to get up at 3 o'clock in the goddamned morning so I can be at work at 6. And then I don't get home unless I'm lucky enough to get somebody to give me a ride until 6 o'clock. Then in order to get up in time, in order to get a full night's sleep to go to work, I have to go to bed at 7 o'clock. Yeah, that did not work. That's not going to work. Really fucking hard to shift your sleep schedule like that, and they don't quite understand that fact. There's a lot they don't understand, but that's another story. So, rather than, getting someone on to read the Apocrypha, because I knew I was going to have all kinds of shit I had to do in very little time, and I just happened to have recorded an episode or an interview with Gleb Tsipursky of Intentional Insights. I figured makes more sense for me to put that out this weekend, since I really wasn't going to be able to do a good Apocrypha episode, and let you all hear that, rather than half-ass shit and come up with something that's really horrific. Now, there is one minor issue that crops up every now and then with this interview, and that is, for some odd reason, we were having Skype issues. So, like, the first couple of times we tried calling one another, neither of us could hear the other person, even though the Skype call connected. So we managed to get it to work, but every now and then there were some glitches. I've edited all but one of them out, and the last one I left in just because it was so minor. It wasn't nearly as bad as the others, so it wouldn't be annoying to anyone. Whereas the others were just, he Cylons for a second and then completely cuts out, and then it's like 5 minutes of us going, hey, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? And then that got all solved. Somehow. But even if you've heard him on other podcasts, the only other podcast I've heard him on, I know he's been on a bunch, but the only one that I've listened to that he's been on that I can remember is The Scathing Atheist, and they gave him, I think, 20 minutes or so, something like that. This is obviously a full hour of me talking to Gleb about the Pro-Tooth Pledge, Intentional Insights, and other things. So hopefully you'll find it enjoyable, even if you've heard other interviews with him. And I need to thank Patreon supporter Cecilia for, I hope that's how her name is pronounced, increasing her contribution for the show. That really helps because even though I was supposed to be working 10 hours, they changed their mind on like Wednesday and said, "Oh yeah, you're back on your normal 8 hours." So I got a little extra money, but not a lot, and that just, well, that hurts. But actually, the extra money I got is all gone because I had to buy a new weed eater. My old one died, and, well, things were getting kind of shaggy around the yard, so I had to do something. And it's just a long story, and I won't go into it in this episode. Maybe I'll do it the next one or some other episode. Anyways, all right, with all that out of the way, let's get to my interview with Gleb. And next week, it will be America and I again. Not sure exactly what we're going to do. Probably be another news episode, as long as the two of us can keep from gabbing so much.
My name is Gleb Tsipursky, and I'm a professor at Ohio State, and I do a whole bunch of stuff. My focus right now is on addressing the lies and deceptions in our politics recently, and this is part of a broader project I'm running called Intentional Insights. Intentional Insights is a nonprofit organization that promotes research in behavioral science for a broad audience. And it's a nonprofit that I co-founded about 3 years ago, and I'm the volunteer president there. And so we've been doing that in order to help promote behavioral science. There's a lot of great folks in the secular, reason-oriented movement who promote hard science, kind of biology, astronomy, physics, and so on. But really very few people who promote the social sciences, behavioral science. And that's very much kind of down to earth, the way that we think and feel and behave. It kind of impacts us much more than cosmology or stuff like that. So that's why we decided to fill that hole and promote behavioral science. Now, the recent election cycle has been really problematic for how people made their decisions. And behavioral science is concerned with this stuff, how people make their decisions. And there have been so much lies and deception going on in this election cycle, both in the U.S. And in the U.K. too, with Brexit. This election cycle in the U.S. and the U.K. with Brexit has been filled with lies and deception. And very dangerous things, lies and deceptions, which are undermining our democracy at their core. And so we decided to focus most of our efforts on lies and deceptions and solving these using behavioral science methodology. So that's what we're focused on, communicating effectively to people who are not really concerned with truth and reason in politics or in other areas of life. How do you communicate effectively to them? Many reason-oriented people try to use arguments, debates, and so on to reach these people. But you know what? Those methods, the research in psychology shows that they just don't work in reaching people who are not already oriented toward truth and reason and science. And so we are looking for effective means of reaching those people, and also just effective means of changing the incentives for politicians and other public figures to tell the truth and avoid lies. And that's the focus of our biggest project right now, which is the Pro-Truth Pledge, which we can talk about. But that's a little bit about what I do. I'm writing a book on this topic called The Alternative to Alternative Facts, Fighting Post-Truth Politics with Behavioral Science, which I hope will be out later this year, but, early next year, definitely. So that's what's going on with me.
Okay, that sounds really interesting because that is... I was a psychology major in college for a while, so I have some understanding of, behavioral things and that field. And one of the things that I was just fascinated with when I was reading things like Freakonomics was how the behavioral sciences actually showed that economic theory was not always correct and quite oftentimes was wildly wrong. So, and certainly with this past election, as you
pointed out, we've had a lot of lies and half-truths and, things even worse than that. So it's certainly, you're doing some important work. And it's really hard to, I know for a lot of this stuff, it's really hard to distill some of the stuff into a simple answer because you're dealing with complicated issues. But one of the things that I've noticed in dealing with people who are, sided towards, say, Trump in the election, they would say, what, I was talking with one woman who, she was saying, well, they've got to raise the minimum wage. She was a Trump voter. And I was like, that Trump is against the minimum wage. And she's like, oh, he'll never be able to get rid of it. She just dismissive of the idea. Never mind the fact that at the time, his nominee for the Secretary of Labor also wanted to get rid of the idea of a minimum wage. And with a Republican Congress, if he ever puts that before them, there's a chance that he could get it through. Whereas if we had a Congress that was evenly split or dominated by the Democrats, he'd never get that through. So, I mean, how do you, if you can kind of give an idea about how to deal with a situation like that, where somebody just dismisses a fact?
Yeah, so there's a common psychological phenomenon called confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is essentially in what's known in common language as looking at the world through rose-colored glasses and seeing what you want to see as opposed to things that are really there. So when someone is presented with a contradiction, such as, oh, this candidate that I like is doing something or may do something I don't like, most people who are not oriented toward truth, reason, and logic will dismiss the idea that this candidate will do something that they don't like. That's just that's just how that works. It's called confirmation bias, and people dismiss that idea because it threatens their worldview. So what you need to do is figure out what their worldview is and talk to their worldview, talk to their emotions. So this woman probably has fear and anxiety about Trump being the type of person who can undermine the minimum wage. And so what you need to do is not present it to her as a threat, as saying, well, Trump will do this, but guide her through understanding that this is a possibility. Say, hey, let's talk about how we can protect the minimum wage. Let's imagine a scenario where, Trump is going to be in office and both houses are going to be controlled by Republicans. Now, Republicans have a certain incentive to get rid of the minimum wage to support their base, to, appeal to big business and so on. So what's the likelihood of this scenario happening, that Trump presents this before Congress and this will go through? Let's talk about it. Let's see what the likelihood is and have her figure this out as opposed to give her a foregone conclusion. I'll give you an example. I went on Scott Sloan's show. Now, I know you're from Tennessee, but you used to be in Columbus. So you might remember 700 WLW, which is the major conservative radio station in the Columbus area, in the Ohio area. It's Donald Trump was on Scott Sloan's show shortly before I was. That's kind of a prominent radio show. And we're talking about the Ohio State attack, terrorist attack, where Muslim rammed his car into some students at Ohio State and then went out with a knife and stabbed some people before he was shot and killed. So Scott Sloan, this conservative radio talk show host, and I think he was pretty critical of Muslims and this thing, Muslim terrorism and so on. So I told him, hey, Scott, let's talk about this. It's very natural to experience fear and anger. So I started off with validating his emotions, not saying that his feelings were wrong. But then let's talk about what we actually want. We want safety and security, right? Like, that's what we want. Now, I went into safety and security because I know that based on research, that's what Scott Sloan and other Republicans in general tend to care about. I care more about civil rights for Muslims than I care about safety and security, but I have some caring for safety and security. So I said, I made us both allies around this problem. I said, we both care about safety and security. Now, what happens if we persecute Muslims because of this incident at Ohio State? Well, let's look at the numbers. In 2015, this happened in 2016, so I said the previous year. In 2015, there were 6 Muslims who were committed terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. And there were a whole total of about 1.8 million Muslims in the United States. So that's like picking out, if you focus on Muslims, that's like picking out a terrorist from several football stadiums. Not a very high chance of actually finding a terrorist if you focus on Muslims. So we're going to waste our resources of safety and security, Scott. We have limited resources to spend on policing if we focus on Muslims. And we're going to let the real terrorists slip by. That's really dangerous for our safety and security, Scott, I said. Then I said, well, what happens with Muslim communities if we persecute them? They're going to be really unlikely to reveal the terrorists in their midst. And we don't want that, Scott, do we? And finally, I said, there's already evidence showing that Muslims are being recruited into the ranks of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on because of Donald Trump's anti-Muslim rhetoric. So ISIS is using his rhetoric in recruiting videos, and so is Al-Shabaab and others. So we're going to make more terrorists by persecuting Muslims. So if we want safety and security, then persecuting Muslims is not the answer. We should be nice and kind and generous toward them, even if we don't feel like it. So here our emotions are lying to us, Scott. We shouldn't be nasty toward Muslims. That's just not where the numbers show. That's not what will give us our safety and security. And in this conversation, he agreed. He updated his beliefs. He said that, yes, that makes sense. We both want safety and security, and we should be nice to Muslims, even if we don't feel like being nice to Muslims. So this kind of narrative and framework structure, where you validate their emotions, place yourself on the same side as them, and lead them toward what the actual facts are, as opposed to what they feel and, because their emotions are lying to them. That's when you get into an in-depth conversation that actually results in a good outcome of them changing their minds.
Yeah. Because one of the things I've noticed that most people, regardless of their political persuasion, is whatever their politics are, they have not put a lot of thought into any of them. They just regurgitate what they've heard, but they've never sat down and said, well, okay, is this how things really are? Would this really work? They just say, because whomever they follow, be it a talking head on TV or a blogger or a podcaster or whomever, they say, well, this person says it, so they're got to be right, so that's what I follow. If they even put that much thought into it.
Yeah, exactly. So this is why it's really important to get to these influencers like Scott Sloan, who are the people who these people follow, who conservatives follow. So this is why it's really good to get to these influencers, but also you can have these conversations with reasonable conservatives. And, as opposed to saying, hey, Trump will do away with the minimum wage, I could have said to Scott, hey, you need to be nice to Muslims. Right. And what would Scott tell me? Go F yourself. Yeah. That wouldn't have worked. Now, if you walk this woman through a scenario where you explain to her, validate her emotions, and explain to her how together your allies around keeping the minimum wage, how Trump may get rid of the minimum wage, you're going to be much more likely to have a successful conversation. And that's what the research shows. So that's what my research shows, that's what research by others show. You're going to be much more likely to have a successful conversation with people like that.
Right. Now, one thing that, it happens in political discussions and religious discussions and a lot of discussions, is folks sometimes get a little overheated. Mm-hmm. How does one, do you have any suggestions on how to prevent yourself from getting overheated and, just leaping in with an answer which may not solve anything, just may raise the temperature of the argument or the discussion.
Absolutely. So here, the most important thing is what is shown by research on emotional intelligence and social intelligence, which is an area of my expertise. I actually consult for companies and do speaking and training on this in business settings because I do research on business and politics. So in political settings, it's really important to figure out when you're likely to have conversations that are going to cause you to be heated. Now, that applies both to online discussions and in-person discussions. When people experience things like rapid breathing, things like fluttering in their stomachs, things like a wave of heat and the various other signs of emotional arousal, that indicates that they are about to do something that's driven by emotions and as opposed to driven by their intellect. We have two systems of thinking. The autopilot system, which is the emotional, intuitive system. It's the one that evolved in the ancient savannah. It's the flight or fight response. Those are the two, that's the system. And that's very quick to act. It takes several milliseconds to respond, and it's very quick. It can be very overwhelming to respond to. Now we have another system, the intentional system. That's a much slower system. It takes a second to respond as opposed to the autopilot system, which takes milliseconds, so it's several hundred times slower. It's quite a bit weaker. It evolved in order to allow us to survive in tribes. So if you think of what the two systems are in an argument with someone, if someone calls you, if someone says something that is provocative, the immediate intuition of some people would be to say an aggressive thing in response. You're a jerk. No, you're a jerk. Something like that. Not helpful for actually changing somebody's mind. Or if another kind of response, that's the fight response. Another kind of response is the flight response. That's kind of like shutting down. And it's like, I'm just walking away from this. I can't engage with this. Like, you're a jerk. Okay, you know what? I just don't want to have this conversation. Neither of those responses is going to result in changing someone's mind, if that's your goal. Now, the intentional response would be to calm down your feelings and take the time to address yourself and say, hey, this person is calling me a jerk. Why is that person calling me a jerk? Saying, hey, what's going on with you? Why are you saying that? This seems like not very productive. What's going on here? That sort of response is very counterintuitive. It's very hard to do if you're not prepared to do it, if you're not prepared for that response. And so doing that requires noticing those arousal emotions in yourself and calming yourself down, taking some deep breaths, clenching your fists. There are a variety of other strategies which I talk about in my writings and blogs. You can go to intentionalinsights.org to check those out. But anyway, calming yourself down and responding intentionally with curiosity, trying to figure out why the person is being aggressive or what about that person's statement has made you upset or frustrated. It doesn't have to be like something obvious like you're a jerk, something, a conservative who hears something like Trump lies all the time is likely to have a very strong negative response to that because they would perceive it as an attack on their candidate, on the person they support, regardless of whether it's true or not. That sort of statement in a discussion will result in a conservative being really upset and shutting down or being aggressive in response. Not helpful. So if you are a conservative and you hear that sort of statement, you need to calm down, calm your feelings, and figure out why the person who's saying that, who's likely a liberal, is saying that and whether it's actually true or, to what extent does the liberal just trying to express her or his feelings about it, and vice versa. So that is going to be the key, emotional intelligence and self-management.
Right. I know I read somewhere that most people, as far as like things like the arguments that sway a lot of them when it comes to things like politics are based on emotions and not reasons. Mm-hmm. So the response to the stabbing incident you mentioned is that a lot of them have is based on emotions, not thinking, well, what's going on here? You know, what caused this? What can we do to prevent it? What, what's the real risk of threat to everybody else and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Absolutely. So that's where emotions are much more powerful. So the autopilot system is much more powerful than the intentional one. And most people, they fall into the trap of emotional reasoning. Now, emotional reasoning is one of the many thinking errors that we can fall into. And this thinking error is a particularly subtle and corrosive one, really harmful. And it basically tells us that whatever we feel is true. Whatever we're comfortable with is true. And this is really, really harmful because our guts, our intuitions are going to be wrong often. They're often going to be wrong, but people tend to feel that if they go with their intuition, they're doing the right thing. If they go with their guts, they're doing the right thing. And that's really dangerous and really harmful for their ability to evaluate the world successfully. It's one of the things that I talk about a lot as being really harmful, this sort of emotional reasoning, where we mistake what we're comfortable with for what is true.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. But let me ask you this, and this is, in theory, it'll be a little bit of a curveball question. If you get somebody to have a right opinion on, a recognition of reality using an emotional argument rather than relying on facts and statistics and things like that, is that wrong? Or are you more concerned with getting people to recognize the truth regardless of the means, or do you want them to have, a path that, while it does thread through emotion, it is an intellectually based one?
Oh gosh, this is a really important question. Thank you for asking that. It's not a curveball at all. So I think we as reason-oriented people often tie our hands behind our backs by just trying to have an intellectual discussion with people, and that's absolutely a mistake in my opinion. We need to be willing to use all sorts of tools as long as we are not being dishonest. So appeals to emotions are perfectly fine, I think, as long as we are using accurate facts. If we want to discuss a little girl who has been hurt by let's say we want people to care about environmental pollution, it's going to be so much more effective to talk about a little girl who has had some birth defects because of let's say some carbon dioxide, whatever, something in the atmosphere, smog. That's going to be so much more powerful than talking about the statistics on the 1,000 little girls that had birth defects. That's just not how people are wired. People are wired, according to the research, to respond to stories and emotion much more powerfully than they respond to their autopilot system, much more powerfully than they respond to their intentional system. So no, we should absolutely not tie our hands behind our back. We should use stories. We should use emotional engagement as long as it leads toward the truth. We shouldn't use stories that are deceptive. So if this girl happened to have a birth defect, but it wasn't due to environmental pollution, we shouldn't use that story. But we should definitely look for stories that accurately represent and illustrate these broader tendencies and trends, because otherwise we are just going to be shut down and not make any sort of impact on public discourse. And this is one of the fundamental things that intentional insight focuses on trying to effectively communicate these things to a broad audience. That's why we use visual images, which are quite a bit more powerful than words. We use stories. We use various sorts of emotional engagement, talk to people's emotions about, I talked to Scott Sloan, right? You saw me in the narrative about Scott Sloan talk about emotions, talk about fear, talk about anger. I didn't leave them behind. I didn't negate them. I talked to them. I said, hey, I used fear. I talked about, we don't want the terrorism to keep happening, therefore we should be nice to Muslims. I used his fear of and his desire for security and his fear of terrorism to appeal to him and get him to change his mind. That's really important. I mean, I absolutely endorse that.
Okay. I'm just curious. I'm not sure how to phrase this because I don't want to have to edit this out, but I also don't want to insult people who potentially could be listening. I watched a video that was a documentary, and I went into watching the documentary on the side of the people that did the documentary. So it's not an oppositional view at all on my part. And they were, clearly, they shaped the documentary because they wanted an emotional response out of people. And the problem I had was at the end of the video, they showed something that was, it was a kick to the groin. It was so emotionally painful. And I found myself, when I was sitting there watching the video, mad at them for putting that in there because I was already, with them. Mm-hmm. And even after that moment, I was still with them, but it was like I didn't need to see that extra, I didn't need to have the knife twisted in me. It was already there, and I was wounded. I didn't need to have that twist. And I'm just kind of wondering, is it possible to go too far and actually twist that, that emotional knife so much that you have the opposite effect of the one you intended?
Good question. I think what you need to think about is your audience. And for certain audiences like yourself and myself, I don't respond that much to emotions because I know the research on this and I train myself not to. And there tend to be a lot of reason-oriented people who are like me and like you, who don't respond that much to emotions because they train themselves not to. They tend to be pretty skeptical, right? So that's part of the being in the movement. But the mistake that we in the reason-oriented people most often make is not having enough emotions, not having nearly enough emotions. So this is a psychological failure mode, a fallacy that's called failure at other minds. So failure at other minds assumes that other people are like us, whereas in reality, people in the secular movement and the reason-oriented movement tend to be outliers. We are not like the majority of the American population. We are really different. And we are really different in the way that we tend to resonate less with emotions than most people do. So we need to go much further than we intuitively think is appropriate in using stories and emotional engagement to get to people. Otherwise, we will fail. We will not get done what we want done. This has been what Intentional Insight was trying to do within the reason-oriented movement, trying to use the research and behavioral science on how people actually think, then to actually get things done. This is when, you see reason-oriented people getting into endless debates with theists or, whatever, in politics or so on, and they think that these debates will solve something, will change people's minds. Well, no, they won't, because most people with whom they're debating are not really oriented toward reason. Now, if those people were like themselves, then the debates would change their minds. That's why reason-oriented people can have debates with other reason-oriented people and actually result in people changing their minds. But people who aren't reason-oriented, which is the large majority of the American population and the population in other countries, will not change their minds by using reason and so on. So even if it feels counterintuitive to you, do use more emotions, do use more stories. And even if you will put some of your audience off, you will get much more of your audience than you intuitively would feel that you would get.
Okay. So now, I don't know if you listen to Penn Jillette's podcast or not.
Mm-hmm. I do. I don't listen to his podcast, but I know about it.
Okay. Well, he had a 2-part episode that he put out this past week. I've only listened to the first part. I haven't had a chance to get the second one, but he had Peter Boghossian on there. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not.
Yes, I'm familiar with him.
Okay. And they were complaining that, people will debate an American, but they won't debate an imam on things like religion. And it seemed to me when I was hearing that, well, it's like, well, we'll ignore the fact that it's really hard for an American to debate an imam in Saudi Arabia. Distance and language barriers make that very hard. But also guys like imams, and you could say the same about the Pope or anybody else who's high up in a religion, is that they've had so many discussions on these topics that they have, they can be slippery. So I can't imagine that somebody like the Pope or, one of those crazy imams, you could actually either on an intellectual or an emotional basis make an argument that gets through with them to them because they've been doing their job for so long that they're so wrapped up that there's just no way to crack their perspective. Is what I'm saying. Is that the case, or is there actually hope that if you could say get the Pope in a corner and have an emotion-based argument with him, or discussion, we won't call it an argument, that you could actually get him to say, hey, maybe we should change our position on this whole birth control thing, or maybe we should allow women to become priests?
That's an important question, and this is something that this is one of the reasons I went on Scott Sloan's show and saw if it's possible to change, pretty conservative Republicans' perspective on Muslims. Now, a lot of people would say that it's, they'll just hate Muslims and that there's no changing their minds. But I went on his talk show and I had a conversation with him that showed him that, it's, beneficial to change his mind on Muslims. So I'd say that there are probably certain issues on which it is possible to have those conversations and change their minds if their underlying interests actually cause them to be blind to their actual goals. So, for example, you can change the minds of conservatives about Muslims because their underlying values are around safety and security. And persecuting Muslims doesn't actually contribute to those underlying values. Now, in other areas, or, with this woman, let's say, who has this obvious contradiction between Donald Trump and the minimum wage, you can't change her mind on Donald Trump being a potential threat to minimum wage. So those are doable things. So so you have to look for cases where people's underlying values are in contradiction with their espoused positions. And there are so many of those around. You can, let's say, with the Catholic Church, you can probably have conversations about, it would be beneficial in many ways for there to be women priests or gay priests or so. And that can be a potential conversation which people's minds can be changed on, because there are underlying values that are in contradiction there. So you'd have to look at issues, basically. But you definitely can do it in a number of issues, as I showed by going on Scott Sloan's show and talking about conservatives, Muslims.
Right. And obviously, just come. One thing whenever I'm having a discussion with somebody who doesn't share my political beliefs, is I try not to come at the issue head on, because I feel like they've got a ready answer. And if I come at it from some, an angle that they may not expect, I can shift their mind.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So
there are many ways of doing this. But the main thing is to put yourself on their side, validate their emotions, see where their positions are in contradiction with their actual goals, and see how you can show that to them.
And it sounds easy, but it's not.
It's not.
Do you, in the works that you're going to be putting out, do you have, like, I know you've said you're going to be discussing about, getting yourself calm so you don't the discussion doesn't get heated. But are you going to have other tips as well?
Yes, of course. So on intentionalinsight.org, the nonprofit I run, I help run. I'm the volunteer president, and there are plenty of other people who are involved who are awesome, and I really appreciate their participation. There are a bunch of articles that talk about how to change people's minds, how the psychology behind how people think, and including how to change people's minds. So a good one is called Collaborative Truth-Seeking. It's on February 20th, 2017. So you can just Google Collaborative Truth-Seeking and Intentional Insights, and you'll find that article. And there are a whole bunch of other articles. I published some articles in The Humanist, Free Inquiry, American Atheist Magazine, and a number of other articles in secular reason-oriented venues that talk about that offer tips on how to do so. So this is kind of in terms of having healthy conversation. Another thing that you can consider doing is just getting a shared basis for what is true and what is oriented toward the truth, which is one reason that we created the Pro-Truth Pledge at protruthpledge.org. And if one thing you can do is encourage your collaborator in any discussion to go to that website and see if they're comfortable taking that pledge at protruthpledge.org, and of course yourself taking that pledge to be committed to the truth. And then you'll have a shared basis for discussion for any sort of conversation you want to have. You'll be much better off because you will have a shared basis for what is truth and how to have truth-oriented behaviors.
Okay, and I'll have links to all that in the show notes so people can find it if they're interested in checking that out. Here's one thing that I'm curious about, because it's something that often comes up in discussions like the one that you had with Scott Sloan. We have this image propagated by the media and others that, Muslims are a terrible threat to Americans, even though the statistics don't bear that out. Mm-hmm. And there's one thing that it's nagged at me for a long time, and unfortunately there's not any good statistics on it, but I would be willing to bet in any given year that more children die because their parents decided to rely on prayer in the U.S. Mm-hmm. than were killed by terrorism. Mm-hmm. And, I'm somehow trying to figure out a way to formulate something around that so I can kind of shift people to think that, the problem is not the religion, it's all religions, and it's, because we, our perspective on those crazy Christians that pray and let their kids die rather than getting them to the doctor so they can treat their urinary tract infection. That's a greater threat, and we've normalized that to a degree, so we don't see them as representative as Christianity as a whole. Probably the same way lots of people in the Muslim world don't see the terrorists as representatives of Islam as a whole.
Yes. Yeah, so that's definitely a dangerous thing it's something to be really careful about bringing up in a conversation, and it's something to know how to bring up effectively. Because there are many people who say, well, you're attacking Christians now, and who themselves are Christian, and they would feel threatened. So you want to think about people's identities and people's worldviews. And so instead of saying, well, there are more children killed by, their parents not bringing them to doctors and prayer, which I totally agree with, is a huge problem. We can talk about what you'd want to do is shift the conversation toward what they care about. Let's say, hey, let's think about all the number of people who are killed by Muslims, and that's probably something, maybe, I don't know, in the United States, maybe something like 40 or 50 last year. Let's think about that, and let's see how many resources we're spending on targeting on addressing all the number of people killed in the United States for terrorism. Let's say, billions and billions of dollars. And let's look at all the other causes of death in the United States. Are we spending that much money on addressing all the other causes of death? Is it really reasonable to spend so much money on addressing other causes of death? Well, let's take a look at how we're addressing the cause of death of, parents not bringing in their children and doing prayer instead. How much money are we using to address that cause of death? There are so many more children who die because of that. Let's look at that and let's see how we're addressing that. And so that way you're not putting yourself against the person, but you're empathizing with that person. You're saying, I care about what you care about. I care about preventing death. And let's look at the way that we are doing it. And let's think about if we're doing it in the best way. Are we distributing our resources appropriately? And so now you're putting yourself on the same side as that person, and you're collaborating together to figure out how we're distributing our resources. And so you're being allies around this topic, as opposed to, and empathizing with this person, as opposed to opposing yourself to that person's identity. And so while you're still getting your end goal met, which is, shifting resources into the problem of Christians not being appropriately punished for letting their kids die, so child abuse, you are having that conversation in a collaborative manner in a way that will actually get the person to hear you. In the same way that I'm not telling Scott, you should be nice to Muslims.
Right. So you told me earlier your family came over here in 91, right?
Yep.
So
just before the fall of the Soviet Union, we came from the Republic of Moldova, which was one of the countries that was conquered by the Soviet Union in 1945, World War II.
Yeah, right. How old were you at that time?
I was 10.
10. Okay, so you probably. I know you have some memories of what it was like living there, but they're probably all not. They're not as strong as memories from 10 years ago or whatever, since you were so young.
Oh, sure. Yes. They're pretty big. Mm-hmm.
I was talking to a woman who was from. I can't remember. It's some part of what used to be Yugoslavia. I don't remember exactly where. It was not far from the city of Dubrovnik, which I can't remember now where that ended up after Yugoslavia and everything broke up. But she's a little older than me, so she's in her 50s, and I think she came over here at about the same time you did, maybe sometime after that. She was telling me things seemed with Trump and all that to be shifting more to like they were in her country before the fall of the Soviet Union. And I was wondering if you shared that view.
Oh, yes, there's absolutely the case. So Trump is exhibiting two traits, which are in parallel with traits exhibited by Vladimir Putin when he came to power in Russia in the late 1990s. And he took Russia from a country that was relatively democratic. So it had freedom of the media and freedom of the press in the 1990s to an authoritarian country, which has and had free elections, which doesn't have freedom of the media, which doesn't have freedom of speech, and doesn't have really free elections right now. So Trump, when he already before, he was attacking the media throughout his campaign. So which is something that Putin did when he came to power, and Trump is threatening to pass libel laws to fine the media for articles that he doesn't like. And that's what Putin did later onward in his presidency. And eventually, through a combination of libel laws and other maneuvers, he was able to squelch down all independent media and make it government-owned or owned by pro-government organizations, which we see. We have things like Fox News is a pro-Trump organization. So that's one similarity. Now, another similarity is what's happening with the election. Putin undermined 3 elections in Russia, and this is a way that he is using to maintain his power. Trump he is on record as praising Putin's strong control of his country. He already, previous to the 2016 election, in October 2016, he said that, the elections are rigged when he thought he was losing. Then once he won, and he didn't win the popular vote, he claimed that he won the popular vote, despite Hillary Clinton actually winning the popular vote by about 3 million votes. And lots of good, honest Republicans rebuked Trump. They said people like Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, John McCain, and others, and Lindsey Graham, they rebuked Trump. They said, hey, the popular vote was fair. It's fine. And Trump is still continuing on with his false claims that the popular vote, that he won the popular vote, and there were millions of illegal immigrants, aliens who voted. And he now launched an investigation into this matter, even though there was no fake voter fraud as he claims. And so there's a lot of danger, or there's quite significant danger, that if he loses the 2020 election, he may choose not to go out of power quietly, but instead try to claim that, there was massive voter fraud for his opponent, and try to stay in power and using various judicial machinations and so on. So there's definitely some similarities there, and there are definitely dangers. And not to make a slippery slope argument that Trump will definitely take power, Vladimir Putin did, but he has showed clear signs that are similar to a lot of stuff that Putin did in Russia.
I don't know if you've ever read, I bring it up because I reread it during the campaign, and it seemed to me that whoever was running Trump's campaign had memorized the book. It's called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. I
didn't read it.
You did or did not?
Did not.
Okay. Hoffer was, he was basically a self-taught sociologist. That's the best way to put it. Mm-hmm. And his book was it's an analysis of mass movements. And he did a lot of research and based a lot of it off of, the things that we discovered had gone on in Germany during the Second World War as well. Mm-hmm. And his argument for combating a mass movement that's, based on emotion and not on actual facts, sort of like how, a lot of Trump's followers operated, is that you have the only way you can do it is to hit it with a different mass movement that mm-hmm. sucks those other people in. And he said the problem you have with that is that it's very easy to lose control of the mass movement and have it go off on its own way. I think the reference he made was that the French Revolution started out rather peaceably, and then everybody just said, screw it, we're cutting everybody else's head off. And it degenerated into chaos. And do you agree with that premise, or do you think that it's possible to blunt it without having to worry about losing control?
Yeah, so this is an important question, and I think let's pick out the strands. So first of all, there's definitely possibility of losing control. I don't think that there's that much possibility of heads being cut off, but I definitely think that there is a possibility of the ending of American democracy as we know it, as I pointed out. Americans tend to underestimate this sort of possibility because they haven't ever experienced a dictator. But there are plenty of countries which went from a democratic context to an authoritarian one. And so we can think of examples. I gave the example of Russia, which went from from a democratic context to an authoritarian one. Now, Russia was democratic for a relatively short time, about a decade before becoming authoritarian. We can turn to another country which was democratic for something like 100 years, over 100 years, before turning authoritarian, and that's Turkey. So Turkey right now is becoming an authoritarian country, where from a democratic one, we had a leader who started off by attacking the media, Erdogan, and then taking more and more power, authoritarian power. Turkey just banned Wikipedia, so really big censorship. And so this is really a country that happened. This happened in countries like Germany. This happened in countries like Spain. This happened in Portugal. This happened in Italy. So this happens in major democratic countries. And this is something that may well happen in the United States. So this is a danger. So I don't want to underestimate the danger. So what can be done about it? I think a movement is what's needed, but not a movement that's oriented toward simply sucking away Trump supporters. Right. So not a movement that sucks away Trump supporters per se explicitly, but a movement that unites people around a different set of values. Because there are lots of people in the United States. Trump won the election by 60,000 votes. And he won those in swing states. He lost the popular vote. So it's not like all of Trump's supporters need to be sucked away. There are plenty of reasonable conservatives like Scott Sloan who can be reached. And, through a conversation on his radio station, which reached a lot of people, I was able to reach a lot of Republicans. And so we can reach a lot of people. Democrats who didn't vote, Republicans, and so on. And what I am trying to do, and what Intentional Insights is trying to do, is form a sort of a counter movement, not a counter movement to Trump, but a counter movement to lies and deceptions. Because that's really the danger. Trump is not the essence of the danger. And, some of my Democratic friends will crucify me for saying this, but really Trump is not the danger. I have to say this. He's not the danger. The lies and the deceptions are the danger.
Right.
Trump?
I was just going to say I agree with that. One of the things that concerns me is that there have been, actions by members of both major parties that have the potential of undermining our democracy, regardless of whether or not Trump gets reelected in 2020 or, whatever happens to that, because the mode seems to be, well, if the person in power isn't in our party, then we oppose anything he wants to do, regardless of the merits of his, what he's trying to do.
Yeah. And so this is a situation that in the behavioral science literature is called a sort of a tragedy of the commons. Now, tragedy of the commons is when everyone shares a common resource, but it benefits certain people to take advantage of that resource, and then the resource gets gobbled up by individual agents who share the resource. So the resource we have, which is trust in our political system and trust in everyone's fairness, fair play, truth, honesty, civility, those are resources which are gobbled up. Now, calling a spade, they're gobbled up more by Republicans right now, especially by Trump, than by Democrats, but by some Democrats as well. And now that Trump won using strategies that destroyed, undermined truth and honesty in our politics, and, Hillary's no saint either, so these strategies, but Trump is much more, according to all the truth fact-checking websites and so on. Now, these strategies are going to be used by future politicians, and that's a huge danger. The harm, the danger to the system of future politicians using the strategies of lies and deceptions that are characteristic of what Oxford Dictionary called post-truth politics, which it called due to Trump's election, mainly due to Trump's election in 2016, and also due to the lies in Brexit, in the campaign, the Brexit Leave campaign. So post-truth politics relates to politics where politicians win by using emotional appeals and appeals to personal beliefs or facts. So basically, lies and deception. Now, to combat these lies and deceptions, what we really need to do is uplift the role of truth in politics and honesty in politics, and make politicians honest. And that's a tall order, because it's beneficial to individual politicians to lie in order to achieve their goals. Now, and right now, we don't have nearly enough people who care about truth and honesty. So this is why we created the Pro-Truth Pledge at protruthpledge.org, which is an institution basically designed to incentivize politicians and other public figures to be honest. And if you go to protruthpledge.org, if your listeners go to protruthpledge.org, you'll see what the pledge is about. It asks everyone to sign it, all of your listeners, everyone to sign it, in order to build up mass support for public figures to sign this pledge. And this pledge calls on public figures to do things like avoid sharing misinformation and checking it before using reliable fact-checking websites and orienting toward the scientific consensus before they share information, verifying their sources, retracting information if it's false, and so on. Things that are oriented toward maintaining our democracy and combating the atmosphere of post-truth politics of lies and deception that's going on right now. That's the point of the Pro-Truth Pledge, and that's the goal of the Pro-Truth Pledge, is to change the incentives for public figures to orient more toward honesty and less toward lies.
Right. And I'm staring at the page now, and I'd be more than happy to sign it because I agree with the pledge. So,
wonderful.
Consider me a convert. What's the punishment for not upholding the pledge after you sign it?
So, yes, that's a really important aspect of what we worked out. How do we create institutions that would prevent politicians from lying? Now, you can look at the FAQ questions on the Pro-Truth Pledge on the second FAQ question. So the pledge is violated when people share misinformation. Now, it may sound easy to sign a pledge and then get the benefits of signing it, which is basically your information on why you signed it and your contact information goes out in an email to people who signed the pledge. So politicians get a lot of public recognition and media advisories for signing the pledge, and that's beneficial. Now, what would keep them from breaking their word once they sign it? Well, we have a clear enforcement mechanism for politicians not signing who violate the pledge by sharing lies. And what we do is have people who sign the pledge, anyone who signs, or any listener who signs the pledge can choose to help with the pledge. And one of the ways that you can help with the pledge, so you can see the check mark on helping with the pledge on the Take the Pledge page. One of the ways you can help with the pledge is monitor public figures who sign the pledge. There's a list of public figures who signed the pledge, and you can monitor them to make sure that they're telling the truth. If you suspect that they violated the pledge, you can go to them and say, hey, in a charity mode, having an innocent until proven guilty assumption, hey, did you misspeak? Did I mishear? It seems like you might have violated the pledge, but maybe I'm mistaken. And see if you're satisfied with their answer. If you're not, there's a Pro-Truth Pledge evaluating committee, mediating committee, which evaluates the evidence you present to them on the politician or other public figure violating the pledge. And then the mediating committee goes to the politician, gives the politician a chance to explain what's going on and say, hey, I didn't violate the pledge, or retract their words, and then it's no harm, no foul. One of the tenets of the pledge is to, the last behavior is celebrate updating. I'll gladly celebrate those who retract incorrect statements and update their beliefs toward the truth. So no harm, no foul, that's all good. If the politician refuses to retract their statements, and we still believe that they violated the pledge, then we issue a ruling of the politician being in contempt of the pledge. Then it's not a mistaken statement. I took the pledge. I can misspeak at any time and make a statement that's false, but without a deliberate intent to deceive. So people who have a deliberate intent to deceive, as demonstrated by failing to retract their statements when their statements are shown to be false, those people are placed in contempt of the Pro-Truth Pledge. And that's a pretty significant thing, because then we issue media advisories to all the relevant news channels. So, for example, I live in Columbus, Ohio. If the mayor of Columbus, Ohio, violated the Pro-Truth Pledge and refused to retract their words, then they'd be placed in contempt of the pledge. We'd issue media advisories to all the media channels in the Central Ohio area, and we'd email all the people who signed up for action alerts, who signed the pro-truth pledge and signed up for action alerts, asking them to tweet the mayor, email the mayor, write letters to the editor, getting the mayor to change his position on whatever issue he violated the pledge about. So this is pretty significant public pressure, and this sort of public pressure is what research shows works well for situations where tragedies of the commons occur. So this is the strategy by which we use to get people to retract their statement.
Okay. How many politicians have you managed to get to sign the pledge?
Yeah, we've got a number already. We got people who are running for a number. I mean, we've got a number of local officials, but for the national level, we've got a number of people who are running for Congress to sign the pledge. For example, Dan Epstein signed the pledge. He's running for Congress in West Texas. We have Ed Albertson sign the pledge, who's running for Congress in Ohio. We have another person whose name escapes me right now, who's running for Congress in Iowa to sign the pledge. So we have some politicians who are oriented toward the truth and honesty to sign the pledge, just like you, who are, Tucker, who are oriented toward truth and honesty, who have signed the pledge. And we actually got one person to retract his statements already based on him signing the pledge. So he shared a post on Facebook which had a, tweet from Trump which said something ridiculous, and then somebody pointed out that tweet is not... Okay, hello?
Yeah.
Do you have my audio now?
Yeah, I do.
Tucker. Okay, good. What was the last thing I said?
A tweet from Trump that was ridiculous. That was the last I heard.
Okay, excellent. So there was a Trump tweet that was ridiculous, which he posted on his Facebook, and somebody of his followers went to Trump's tweet to find it and said, hey, I wasn't able to find it on Trump's tweet page, Twitter, what's up with that? And then, Trump may have deleted the tweet, or Trump might not have made the tweet in the first place. It's pretty easy to Photoshop a fake tweet. So he made a statement on his Facebook wall. He edited his statement, said, hey, I took the pro-truth pledge, and therefore I am retracting the statement that this is an actual true tweet. It may not be a true tweet. So this is an example of the pro-truth pledge at work.
Okay. And I am active with the local Democratic Party, and I will certainly bring this up with them because they are desperately looking for an edge to get people elected to, local and state and federal offices in this area because it's a deep red state. So,
yeah,
this is
definitely something that provides an edge, and it's more likely. It's easier for Democrats to take the pledge than Republicans because one of the aspects of the pledge is that this is orienting toward the scientific consensus. So there are more Republican issues that are, the scientific method is the best method that we as human beings have created to find the truth. And unfortunately, there are currently more Republicans who are opposed to the science, for example, climate denial, than Democrats. So it is more likely for Democrats to be able to take the pledge and abide by it than Republicans, unfortunately. And I hope this pledge will encourage more Republicans to be more oriented toward truth and honesty in science.
Yeah, my particular representative in Congress is a rather mendacious liar, so there's no way we can get her to sign it. But if it helps somebody defeat her in the election, then I am all for it. She, it's not that I disagree with her that infuriates me. It's the fact that she, bald-faced lies when she responds to any of the emails I sent to her on a subject. It's,
That's the most frustrating. I'm sorry to hear that, Tucker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I should point out that when I was living in Ohio, Kasich was actually my representative in Congress, and I met him, and he, for all his faults, he at least seemed to be, savvy enough to recognize when things are, that even if he didn't agree with something, it made more sense for him to go with it than to fight against it.
Yeah, I think Kasich is Kasich's of Republicans, he's quite credible, and I appreciate Kasich. I appreciate people like John McCain and so on. And Scott Sloan is, the host I talk to is a reasonable Republican who can recognize when a spade is a spade. So, yeah, I hear you. And there are plenty of Republicans like that, and I really appreciate them. And I very much support their orientation toward truth and honesty. So the more people can get oriented toward truth and honesty, the better. And one of the nice things about the pledge is that if a Democratic or a Republican candidate signs it and her or his opponent does not, they can attack their opponent for not signing it and say, hey, why haven't you signed the pro-truth pledge? What do you have to hide?
Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Any parting comments you'd like to make?
I'd encourage folks to check out Intentional Insights at intentionalinsights.org and sign the Pro-Truth Pledge at protruthpledge.org and email me at gleb, Gleb, at intentionalinsights.org if you want to know more about my work or want to get involved.
Okay. Well, I thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me on, Tucker.
Okay.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fosnuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.